I used to be wrong about psychosis. More precisely, I never reflected on what it means for someone to have a psychotic break. I used to believe all the stereotypes one hears growing up. Oh, that person? They're just crazy, and nothing but. But that all changed when one of my close friends had a psychotic break. I now think that individuals who are prone to psychosis engage with the world with a much greater sensitivity than you and I. In this video, I will share how I reached this conclusion. Obviously, out of respect, I'm not going to psychoanalyze a friend of mine. Instead, I'm going to be focusing on the protagonist from Vladimir Nabokov's short story, Signs and Symbols. In Signs and Symbols, Nabokov describes a character who suffers from referential mania. Referential mania, as Nabokov describes, refers to a state where an individual believes that everything that she is experiencing makes some kind of reference to her. Now, referential mania isn't concerning when someone's actually referring to you. For example, someone might call you by your name. In such a case, there seems to be no cause to freak out. You can comfortably engage with the person calling out your name without blaming a demiurge that is addressing you and only you. Moreover, it's completely normal to suffer from referential mania to a certain degree. For instance, sometimes we wrongly assume that someone is gossiping about us when we are not even the subject of conversation. However, the difference between you and I and Nabokov's character is that Nabokov's character finds reference to himself in all of his experience. Section 1. Fear. When I read Signs and Symbols for the first time, I sympathized with a fear-driven response to referential mania. Consider this scenario. Imagine that you see your name spelled out by clouds casually floating in the sky. Or you bump your foot into a curb 7 times on the 7th day of the week, when you get a call that your several-lettered friend has won the lottery on the 7th scratch card they bought on the 7th day of the month. What kind of response is appropriate when faced with this information? Suppose I told you that your entire life thus far has been an elaborate email from the universe to communicate with you, and only you. It is no wonder that Nabokov's character attempts to take his own life in Signs and Symbols. Our brains already have to filter through a lot of experiential information. Now, add an additional lens that taints your experience with the world with a layer of self-reference. How terrifying. Imagine that someone calls out your name and you have to deal with a nested reference where the person calling your name is also alluding to a grand message or a sick joke. Furthermore, suppose we ignore the possibility that the intentions behind the belligerent references is malicious. Indeed, let us even grant that the intentions of the entity sending the message are well-meaning. Even then, referential mania is tiring. It is tiring to constantly pay attention to the references. And how does one even begin to reconcile the possibility that they are the only one who is being communicated with? What good or bad must you have done to deserve such a fate? Subsequently, I sympathize with Nabokov's character. There is no rest for a mind that is constantly wrestling with referential mania, at least in death. The references to Nabokov's protagonist would end. Section 2. Coincidence. Someone who strictly adheres to rationality and its principles might object to a fear-driven response. Indeed, Nabokov's character's experiences can be explained away by rationality that chalks up all experience as being merely coincidental. Subsequently, a rationalist could contend that any fear-driven response is ill-founded. If we are constantly receiving a seemingly infinite influx of experiential information, we will naturally experience what seem to us as anomalies. For example, suppose a bird sits on your shoulder or a butterfly lands on your finger. Do you take these to be signs that the bird and butterfly want to communicate with you, as if to suggest that the universe is trying to talk to you? The rationalist would take issue with such a response. She would object by arguing that our potential for experience is extremely broad. There is no basis for privileging your experience with a butterfly over the act of doing the dishes, waking up, or even burping. Indeed, the rationalist would not be far off in suggesting that privileging one experience over another borders on mild narcissism. For what makes you special enough to think that a butterfly wants to talk to you? To the butterfly, a flower, a painting, a rock, and your hand are all the same. I'm inclined to side with this objection. Nonetheless, in the case of Nabokov's characters' referential mania, every experience receives equal weight. Thus, the protagonist of Nabokov's book can rescue himself from the charge of being mildly narcissistic. A burp for this protagonist harbors a hidden message that is as profound as the butterfly that rests on your fingers. At this point, I think the rationalist must submit to the genius and perhaps lunacy of the referential maniac, because the referentialist is not arbitrarily privileging certain events over others. Where the rationalist takes all experience to be coincidental, the referential maniac takes all experiences to be synchronous and meaningful. Now, how do we privilege one position over the other? More importantly, do we even need to privilege one position over the other? Perhaps not. Section 3. Meaning making. Let us take a step back and examine the motivations behind both positions. The rationalist explains away anomalies through coincidence, for that is how they make sense of the world. If they do not take such a position, they need to open themselves up to all sorts of metaphysical commitments. For example, if the extreme rationalist grants that a certain event happened because of some external non-human force, then the rationalist would also need to remain open to the possibility of angels, pixies, gods, demons, etc. Of course, these kinds of metaphysical commitments are completely reasonable to a lot of people. However, at some point, the rationalist must admit that there are certain flaws to her mode of thinking, and that some events are simply impossible to explain. Why else would a bird sit on your shoulder while you are thinking about birds? Perhaps the rationalist's answer is not adequate. No rational mode of thinking is capable of describing the vastness of experience. For the extreme referentialist, coincidence is but a tinted lens to view a world full of meaning. And it is impossible to fully experience the world without opening up yourself to all possibilities that perhaps are not coincidental. And thus, merely seeing the clock at 3:33 p.m. on the 3rd of March is enough to convince them that an angel is trying to communicate with them. And who knows, such a position might be justifiable. Consider again Nabokov's character. Every detail in the novel is indeed making reference to the protagonist in some form, at least on a meta level. On a meta level, the character is being described to the audience at all times, and perhaps the character has become aware of this unfortunate fact. The reader receives all kinds of information about events that are all seemingly unrelated to the protagonist, and yet in the work itself, these events do make reference to the protagonist, and perhaps then the fearful response or the paranoid response of the character is understandable. In other words, the protagonist has broken the fourth wall in the book and cannot fathom that such an act is possible. Admittedly, and obviously, the fictional realm of Nabokov's character is distinct from the realm we live in, Earth. But if we grant that such a fictional realm exists, the protagonist's response is pretty justified. Reflect on the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who have read this short story. All of them learned about the intimate details of the life of the protagonist. Can we really blame his fear-driven response? What if your life was constantly exposed to the masses? Section 4. Openness to experience. At the end of the day, the rationalists and referentialists are simply trying to pull some meaning from a world that is indifferent to their thirst for meaning. Most people are somewhere between the extreme ends of both positions. They're somewhere between a rationalist and a referentialist. Not everyone is brave enough to take up the challenge of labeling all experience as meaningful. The referentialist's bravery should be admired. Where the rationalist limits the possibility of their experience, the referentialist does not, despite there being a very real possibility that there is no grand conspiracy, there is no higher purpose. Yet, the referentialist rushes forth against the indifference of a world that refuses to acknowledge her. At the risk of sounding cliched, I think all of us should learn to open ourselves to both positions under different circumstances. Different circumstances warrant different responses. If a bird rests on your shoulder, you should open yourself up to the possibility of there being something more, if only to enhance your experience of hosting a bird on your shoulder. Why else would a bird land on your shoulder when you're thinking about a bird, right? At the same time, an email sent at 1:11 p.m. probably has nothing to do with a grand conspiracy. Indeed, it doesn't even add anything remotely beautiful to the process of sending an email. You're sending an email when you should be sleeping. How about you cut the bullshit and go to sleep? At least that's how I chalk up the workings of the world. At the end of the day, you get to decide. So it's perfectly valid if you want to make the email meaningful and the bird meaningless because you hate nature and love work. And that's kind of neat because no one but you gets to decide how you find meaning in a world that might have none. And that's pretty cool, at least in my view. My view.